Maria Vasquez approached Gabrielle cautiously, the soft rustle of her uniform announcing her presence. "Ms. Wright," she said softly, "would you care for anything else during the remainder of our flight?" The question was simple, but the subtext was clear. Maria was demonstrating proper service while also tacitly acknowledging that she recognized her own failure to intervene earlier. "Just water, thank you," Gabrielle replied, then added, "And Maria, I'd appreciate a word with you before we land." Maria nodded, her expression revealing both anxiety and resignation. "Yes, ma'am. Of course." The soft sound of her retreating footsteps marked her departure. As Maria retreated to the galley, Jessica finally found her voice. The soft rustle of her uniform announced her approach as she moved toward Gabrielle's seat with visible desperation. "Ms. Wright," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "please reconsider. 12 years of service, surely that counts for something. My mother depends on my income for her assisted living facility. I can't lose this job." Her plea was nakedly self-interested, focused entirely on her own circumstances, rather than acknowledging the harm she had caused. Even now, facing the consequences of her actions, Jessica couldn't see beyond her own needs. The overhead light caught a tear trailing down her cheek, leaving a faint track in her perfectly applied makeup. Gabrielle regarded her steadily, the golden flecks in her eyes seemingly more pronounced in the cabin lighting. "Ms. Rivera, your concern for your mother is understandable. However, you've spent 12 years demonstrating exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior Wright Aviation was founded to eliminate. Your actions today weren't an aberration, they were a revelation of character." Jessica's face crumpled, her professional facade finally cracking completely. The soft sound of her bracelet jingling marked her agitated gesture. "I can change, I can do better, I'll take whatever training—" "This isn't about training," Gabrielle interrupted, her voice still calm but firm. "You've had 12 years of training. You've passed every diversity module with perfect scores. You know exactly what to say and what not to say. This is about who you are when you think there are no consequences for your actions." The assessment was devastating in its accuracy. Jessica had indeed mastered the language and policies of inclusion while maintaining her core prejudices, revealing them only when she believed she had the power to do so without repercussion. The soft gasp that escaped her lips was audible to nearby passengers. "Your termination is effective upon landing." Gabrielle continued, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by Jessica, but not projecting to the entire cabin. "HR will contact you with details about your final paycheck and benefits transition. I suggest you use this time to consider how you'll explain this situation in future job interviews." It was the end of the conversation, not delivered with cruelty, but with the clear finality that characterized Gabrielle's leadership style. The soft rustle of documents as she returned to her reading marked the definitive conclusion. Jessica stood for a moment longer, her earrings perfectly still for the first time since the flight began. Her mouth opened and closed as she searched for words that might change the outcome. Finding none, she finally retreated to the galley, the soft sound of her footsteps marking her departure, the last vestiges of her professional persona crumbling with each step. Richard Donovan, watching this exchange and recognizing that his own turn was coming, made a decision. Rather than waiting for Gabrielle to address him, he would take the initiative. Rising from seat 2C, he approached her with what he believed was dignity, but actually revealed his entitlement. His cologne announced his approach before his footsteps did. "Ms. Wright." He began, his tone formal, but with an undercurrent of condescension. "I think we should discuss this situation privately, executive to executive. What happened today was regrettable, but surely not worth jeopardizing a business relationship that has been profitable for both our companies." His signet ring caught the light as he gestured emphatically. Gabrielle looked up at him, her expression unchanged but her eyes assessing. The golden flecks seemed to intensify as she studied him. "Mr. Donovan, there's nothing to discuss. Your behavior today revealed attitudes that are fundamentally incompatible with Wright Aviation's values. The contract cancellation stands." Donovan's face flushed, the veins in his temples becoming visible. "That's absurdly disproportionate. You're willing to damage both our companies over a simple seating misunderstanding." His voice rose slightly, causing nearby passengers to look up from their devices. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Gabrielle corrected him, her voice remaining level. "It was a deliberate choice to treat another human being as less worthy of dignity and respect based on your assumptions about who they were. That choice reflects a character and a corporate culture that Wright Aviation will not be associated with going forward." The soft click of her watch against the armrest punctuated her statement. Donovan's mask of civility slipped further. "This is personal vindictiveness, not business judgment. The board will have serious questions about your decision-making when they learn you canceled a multi-million-dollar contract over hurt feelings." His cologne seemed to intensify, with his agitation becoming almost oppressive in the confined cabin space. It was the wrong approach. Gabrielle's expression didn't change, but her voice took on an edge of steel. "Mr. Donovan, I've been reviewing your company's quality control issues for the past month. The discrimination I experienced today simply confirmed what the data was already telling me. Donovan Industries' problems start at the top, with leadership that believes rules and standards apply differently based on who you are and what connections you have." The precision of this assessment struck Donovan like a physical blow. His body actually stiffened, the soft creak of his leather seat marking the sudden tension. His company's recent manufacturing problems had indeed stemmed from his belief that his business relationships would shield him from the consequences of cutting corners. "The board fully supports my authority to terminate contracts with suppliers who fail to meet our standards, both technical and ethical," Gabrielle continued. "In fact, they hired me specifically for my judgment in these matters." The golden flecks in her eyes caught the light, giving them an almost predatory gleam. Donovan stood speechless, the soft rustling of his expensive suit marking his slight retreat. The reality of his situation finally penetrating his bubble of entitlement. Gabrielle Wright wasn't going to be intimidated, manipulated, or charmed into changing her decision. The contract was gone, and with it possibly his entire company. As this realization sank in, something fundamental shifted in the first-class cabin. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear during boarding, with Jessica and Donovan wielding authority while Gabrielle was treated as an interloper, had been completely inverted. Now, Gabrielle sat calmly in seat 2A, her quiet dignity intact, while those who had discriminated against her faced the consequences of their actions. It was a powerful reminder that true authority came not from uniforms or economic leverage, but from character competence and the courage to stand for one's principles. 11. The consequences. 1,000 words. As the aircraft began its initial descent, the weight of consequences settled heavily on those who had participated in the discrimination. The gentle change in engine pitch signaled their approach to the destination. Jessica moved through the cabin like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically while avoiding eye contact with passengers who had witnessed her behavior. Her once confident stride had been replaced by hesitant movements, her earrings no longer jingling with her subdued motions. Donovan sat rigidly in seat 2C, his phone continuously buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from his executive team as news of the contract cancellation spread through Donovan Industries. The sharp vibrations against the tray table created a staccato rhythm that matched his mounting anxiety. Each message brought worse news than the last, board members demanding explanations, the CFO calculating survival scenarios, the stock price already beginning to slide as rumors spread through the financial markets. Gabrielle maintained her composed observation, noting how the cabin atmosphere had transformed. The soft rustle of documents as she returned them to her briefcase marked the completion of her work for this flight. Passengers who had remained silent during the earlier discrimination now watched Jessica with obvious disapproval. Those who had spoken up, like Angela Porter and Emma Rodriguez, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had stood on the right side of a moral line. The revelation of Gabrielle's identity had changed everything, not because she deserved better treatment as CEO than as an ordinary passenger, but because her position gave her the power to enforce consequences that most victims of discrimination never got to see. The steady hum of the engines seemed to underscore this reality that justice often depended on power, a truth that made Gabrielle's responsibility all the more significant. Maria Vasquez approached Gabrielle's seat as requested. The firm rustle of her uniform announced her arrival. "You wanted to speak with me, Ms. Wright?" Gabrielle gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Please sit for a moment." The leather seat creaked softly as Maria complied. Maria sat her hands clasped tightly in her lap, anxiety evident in her posture. The slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her nervousness. "You recognized my watch during boarding," Gabrielle stated rather than asked. "You knew who I was, or at least suspected." Maria nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, ma'am. I noticed the company logo." The soft sound of her breath catching marked her discomfort. "And yet you didn't intervene when Ms. Rivera was discriminating against me." It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation, but Maria's face flushed with shame nonetheless. "No, ma'am, I didn't." Her uniform rustled as she shifted uncomfortably. Why not? The simple question hung in the air between them. Maria could have offered excuses, Jessica's seniority, fear of retaliation, the need to keep her job to support her father. Instead, she chose honesty. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jessica has power. She's reported crew members who challenge her. People get bad schedules, difficult routes." Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "I need this job for my father's medical care. But..." She looked up, meeting Gabrielle's gaze directly. "That's not a good enough reason." "I should have said something, done something. I'm sorry." Gabrielle studied her for a moment, the golden flecks in her eyes catching the light. "Fear is understandable, Maria. Economic vulnerability is real. But silence in the face of injustice enables that injustice to continue." "Yes, ma'am." Maria's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "I understand if you need to terminate me as well." The sharp creak of the leather seat marked her slight straightening, as if preparing herself for the blow. Gabrielle shook her head slightly. "That's not my intention. What happened today wasn't just about individual actions, but about company culture. A culture where someone like Jessica felt empowered to discriminate while others felt too vulnerable to object. That's a structural issue that requires structural solutions." Maria looked up, surprise evident in her expression. The overhead light caught the moisture gathering in her eyes. "I'd like you to be part of those solutions," Gabrielle continued. "Starting next month, we're forming a frontline advisory committee on service culture. Crew members who interact directly with passengers representing the full diversity of our workforce. I'd like you to serve on that committee." The offer was unexpected, not punishment, but an opportunity to contribute to positive change. Maria's eyes widened, the soft gasp that escaped her lips barely audible above the engine noise. "You want me to help ensure that what happened today doesn't happen again," Gabrielle confirmed. "Your perspective as someone who recognized wrongdoing but felt unable to address it is valuable. We need to create systems where doing the right thing doesn't require exceptional courage or risking one's livelihood." Maria nodded slowly, processing the responsibility being offered. The crisp rustle of her uniform marked her straightening posture. "I won't let you down, Ms. Wright. This isn't about me," Gabrielle clarified. "It's about the company we're building together and the experience we provide for every passenger, regardless of who they are or who's watching." As Maria returned to her duties, the quick click of her shoes marking her departure, Gabrielle turned her attention to Michael Thompson, who had been observing from his position near the front of the cabin. She gestured for him to approach, the fluid movement of her hand barely perceptible. Officer Thompson, she acknowledged when he reached her seat. I'd like to commend your handling of the situation earlier. You showed good judgment in recognizing that there was no legitimate security issue, just discriminatory behavior masquerading as policy enforcement. The scar above his eye caught the light as he nodded in acknowledgement. Michael nodded respectfully, the heavy rustle of his uniform marking his slight bow. Thank you, Ms. Wright, though I should have been more direct from the beginning. You hesitated, Gabrielle agreed, but ultimately did what was right. That's more than many managed today. The gentle clink of ice in her water glass punctuated her statement. In my 15 years of aviation security, I've seen how security concerns are sometimes used to justify biased treatment. Michael admitted his fingers tapping his badge in that now familiar gesture. It's something I've become more aware of in recent years. Gabrielle studied him thoughtfully, the golden flecks in her eyes catching the light. We're restructuring our security training program to address exactly that issue, the misuse of security protocols as a cover for discrimination. I'd like you to consult on that restructuring if you're willing. Like the offer to Maria, it was an opportunity to be part of the solution, rather than simply avoiding being part of the problem. Michael straightened slightly, the firm creak of his leather boots marking the movement. There was recognition of the professional opportunity inherent in the request. I'd be honored, Ms. Wright. As the plane continued its descent, the noticeable change in cabin pressure causing ears to pop throughout the aircraft, Gabrielle turned her attention to the passengers who had spoken up during the incident. She approached Angela Porter first, the subtle rustle of her suit marking her movement to the aisle. Ms. Porter, she said, acknowledging the woman who had been recording the discrimination. Thank you for documenting what happened today. It takes courage to stand up in these situations. The bright jingle of Angela's silver hoop earrings punctuated her nod of acknowledgement. Angela nodded, meeting Gabrielle's gaze with the recognition that comes from shared experience. As another black woman in business, I couldn't stay silent. I've been in similar situations too many times. Her earrings caught the light as she tilted her head slightly. I understand you're in marketing, Gabrielle noted, having overheard Angela's earlier conversation with another passenger. Yes, brand strategy for consumer tech companies. Angela confirmed, the crisp rustle of her blazer marking her slight shift in posture. Gabrielle reached into her suit pocket and extracted a business card, simple, elegant, with just her name and contact information. The sharp sound of the card sliding from her pocket was barely audible. Wright Aviation's marketing department is developing a campaign focused on inclusive travel experiences. Your perspective would be valuable. If you're interested, contact my office next week. Angela accepted the card with a nod of appreciation, the gentle brush of her fingers against the premium cardstock marking the transaction. She recognized that this wasn't mere politeness, but a genuine professional opportunity stemming from her willingness to stand against injustice. Next, Gabrielle approached Emma Rodriguez, the teenage passenger who had spoken up with such moral clarity. Young lady, she said warmly, I want to thank you for your courage earlier. Speaking up when adults are behaving badly isn't easy. The quick creak of Emma's seat marked her straightening posture in response to the recognition. Emma blushed slightly, her fingertips tapping nervously against her phone screen. My mom always says silence is the same as agreement, and I didn't agree with how they were treating you. Your mother has taught you well, Gabrielle observed. What are you interested in studying when you finish school? The steady hum of the engines provided a background to their conversation. Business, actually, Emma admitted. I want to start a company someday that does good things while making money. Is that possible? Her youthful earnestness was evident in the slight lean forward as she asked the question. Gabrielle smiled, her first genuine smile of the flight. The expression transformed her face, illuminating the golden flecks in her eyes. Not only possible but necessary, Wright Aviation offers scholarships for young people interested in aviation business careers. Here's my card. Have your mother contact my office if you'd like to learn more about our internship programs for high school students." Emma's eyes widened as she accepted the card, the excited gasp of her surprise barely audible above the cabin noise. "Thank you, Ms. Wright, I will—" The rapid tap-tap-tap of her fingers resuming on her phone screen marked her immediate documentation of the opportunity. The Morgans received similar recognition for their eventual intervention, though Gabrielle gently noted that earlier action might have changed the course of events significantly. It was a reminder that moral responsibility didn't diminish with age or status. The rhythmic click of Eleanor's pearl necklace punctuated their conversation, a physical reminder of their shared understanding. As the aircraft made its final approach, the urgent increase in engine pitch signaling their imminent landing, Jessica made one last desperate attempt to salvage her situation. The hurried rustle of her uniform announced her approach as she moved toward Gabrielle with what she believed was humility, but actually revealed continued self-interest. "Ms. Wright," she began, her voice carefully modulated to project contrition. "I've been reflecting on my behavior today, and I want you to know I see how wrong it was. If you could find it in your heart to give me another chance, perhaps with sensitivity training or a probationary period." Her earrings swung gently with her imploring gesture. Gabrielle interrupted gently but firmly. "Ms. Rivera, your concern about losing your position is understandable. However, what I witnessed today wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a revelation of character. You demonstrated who you are when you believe there are no consequences for your actions." Jessica's carefully constructed facade of contrition cracked slightly, her collar pin shifting with her nervous movement. "But 12 years of service makes this all the more concerning," Gabrielle completed her thought. "It suggests that this behavior has been occurring for 12 years largely unchecked. How many passengers have experienced discrimination similar to what I witnessed today? How many flight experiences have been marred by your personal judgments about who belongs in which cabin?" Jessica had no answer to that, because the truth that she had indeed been treating passengers differently based on her personal biases for years was indefensible. The sharp sound of her breath catching marked her recognition of this reality. "Your termination stands," Gabrielle concluded. "HR will contact you with details about your final compensation and benefits transition." With that, she returned to her seat for landing, leaving Jessica standing in the aisle, her last appeal rejected not out of cruelty but out of a clear-eyed assessment of accountability. The heavy thump of the landing gear deploying underscored the finality of the decision. Richard Donovan, watching this exchange, made one final attempt to salvage his company's contract. As the aircraft touched down and taxied toward the gate, the powerful deceleration pushing them slightly forward in their seats, he approached Gabrielle with what he believed was a reasonable business proposition. "Ms. Wright." He began, his tone deliberately professional, his cufflinks clicking softly as he gestured. "I understand that today's incident was regrettable. But surely we can find a compromise that acknowledges the mistake without destroying a valuable business relationship. Perhaps a public apology, a charitable donation to a cause of your choosing." He was attempting to reframe the situation as a PR problem rather than a fundamental ethical breach, something that could be managed with the right gestures rather than requiring actual accountability. The overhead light caught the sheen of sweat that had formed on his forehead, despite his attempt at composed professionalism. Gabrielle looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Donovan, this isn't about public relations. It's about whether Wright Aviation chooses to do business with companies whose leadership demonstrates the values we've witnessed today." "Everyone has a price," Donovan insisted, revealing more about himself than he intended. His signet ring tapped an impatient rhythm against his watch band. "Name yours." "A discount on component pricing. Priority delivery schedules. Whatever it takes to move past this unfortunate incident." It was precisely the wrong approach. Gabrielle's expression didn't change, but her voice took on a definitive finality. Mr. Donovan, not everything is transactional. Some principles aren't negotiable. The contract cancellation stands. As the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign was turned off with a distinctive electronic chime, Gabrielle gathered her belongings with unhurried efficiency. The crisp rustle of papers being returned to her briefcase marked her preparations to depart. The flight was ending, but the impact of what had transpired would continue long after everyone had disembarked. For Jessica Rivera, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The hollow clink of her name badge being removed from her uniform punctuated her final moments as a Wright Aviation employee. Her 12-year career was over. Her professional reputation was irreparably damaged. The financial security she had taken for granted was suddenly precarious. For Richard Donovan, the consequences would unfold more gradually, but no less decisively. The persistent, continuous vibration of his phone against his leg marked the ongoing corporate crisis his behavior had triggered. The loss of Wright Aviation's contract would trigger a cascade of financial challenges for Donovan Industries. Shareholders would demand explanations. The board would question his leadership. His position as CEO, long secured by his family name rather than his personal competence, would be in serious jeopardy. For Wright Aviation as a company, the consequences would be transformative. The intense murmur of passengers discussing what they had witnessed would spread beyond this flight, beyond this day. The incident had exposed gaps between stated values and lived reality between policy and practice. Addressing those gaps would require substantive changes in hiring, training, accountability systems, and corporate culture. As Gabrielle prepared to disembark, she reflected on the broader significance of what had occurred. Today's flight had been a microcosm of larger societal challenges. The persistence of discrimination, the economic fears that often silenced potential allies, the entitlement that allowed some to believe rules applied differently based on who you were. But it had also demonstrated how accountability, when properly applied, could begin to address these challenges. Not through performative gestures or empty policies, but through clear consequences for actions that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and respect. That was the legacy Gabrielle intended to leave at Wright Aviation, not just a successful company, but one that contributed to a more just and equitable world. Today's flight, painful as it had been to experience personally, had provided valuable insight into how much work remained to be done. As she walked toward the exit, the firm sound of her heels on the cabin floor marking her departure, Gabrielle nodded respectfully to Captain Ramirez, who stood at the cockpit door. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Ramirez straightened slightly, the sharp rustle of her uniform marking her movement. She acknowledged both the gratitude and the implicit recognition of her intervention during the flight. "Just doing my job, Ms. Wright." "No," Gabrielle corrected gently, the golden flecks in her eyes catching the light one final time. "You were doing what was right." "There's an important difference." With that, she disembarked, leaving behind a cabin forever changed by her presence and the accountability she had brought with her. 12. Justice and Recognition 2,000 Words. The aftermath of Flight 247 rippled through Wright Aviation like a stone dropped in still water. By the time Gabrielle Wright reached her office the following Monday morning, the incident had transformed from a personal experience of discrimination to a watershed moment for the company's culture. The steady hum of the executive floor's climate system provided a backdrop to the unusual quiet that had settled over the normally bustling headquarters. The executive meeting room was filled to capacity, every leadership team member present as requested. The occasional soft clearing of throats punctuated the silence as they awaited their CEO's arrival. The tension was palpable, not from fear of arbitrary punishment, but from the recognition that their CEO had personally experienced discrimination on one of their flights, revealing a gap between the company's stated values and its lived reality. The rhythmic click of keyboards had ceased entirely, the usual pre-meeting chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. Gabrielle entered precisely at 8 a.m., the decisive sound of the door closing behind her, marking her arrival. She was dressed in her characteristic style, professional, elegant, but without ostentation. The jasmine notes of her perfume provided a subtle counterpoint to the room's tension. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the flight, neither diminished by the discrimination she had faced, nor elevated by the power she wielded in response. "Good morning," she began, taking her place at the head of the table. The precise rustle of her suit as she sat punctuated the silence. "I appreciate everyone's presence on short notice. We have important matters to discuss regarding the culture and operations of Wright Aviation." She briefly recounted the events of Flight 247, describing both the discrimination she had experienced and the responses of various crew members and passengers. Her account was factual rather than emotional, focused on observations rather than interpretations. The deliberate tap of her right index finger against her thumb, that now familiar centering gesture, was the only indication of the personal impact these events had had. "I founded this company with a specific vision," she continued, her voice steady, "to create an airline where every passenger is treated with equal dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status. Friday's flight demonstrated that we have significant work to do to make that vision a reality." The firm rustle of clothing marked the collective shifting of the leadership team acknowledgement in motion. Heads nodded around the table. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to minimize what had occurred or suggest it was an isolated incident. The leadership team understood the seriousness of what had happened and their collective responsibility to address it. The resolute click of a pen being set down punctuated their silent acknowledgement. "This isn't just about terminating one flight attendant or canceling one supplier contract." Gabrielle emphasized the golden flecks in her eyes catching the light. "Those were necessary responses to specific behaviors, but they don't address the underlying issues that allowed those behaviors to develop and persist unchecked." She outlined a comprehensive action plan that had been developed over the weekend, not just a reactive response to a single incident, but a proactive strategy to transform Wright Aviation's culture from the ground up. The decisive tap of her finger against a tablet screen marked the transition to the detailed presentation. "First, we're revising our hiring processes to better screen for genuine commitment to inclusive service, not just technical qualifications or performative agreement with diversity statements." HR executives nodded, the brisk rustle of their clothing marking their movement. They were already considering how to implement this directive, minds racing, with possibilities for behavioral interviewing techniques and scenario-based assessments. "Second, we're overhauling our training programs to focus on practical scenarios and ethical decision-making rather than abstract principles or compliance checkboxes." The training director made notes rapidly, the deliberate scratch of pen against paper marking her engagement. She recognized both the challenge and the opportunity in this directive, moving beyond traditional check-the-box diversity training to something that would genuinely change behavior. "Third, we're establishing a frontline advisory committee composed of crew members who interact directly with passengers daily. They'll report regularly on service culture issues with direct access to leadership without fear of retaliation." This announcement generated particular interest, the concentrated murmur of approving whispers rippling through the room. It represented a structural change that would elevate voices traditionally excluded from decision-making processes. The purposeful tap of fingers against tablets marked the noting of this significant development. "Fourth, we're implementing a comprehensive accountability system with clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, regardless of an employee's seniority or technical competence." The legal team exchanged glances, the quick rustle of their clothing marking their subtle communications. They were already considering how to structure this system to be both fair and effective, balancing due process with clear consequences. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, We're launching a company-wide conversation about what it truly means to embody Wright Aviation's values, not just in official communications or when executives are watching, but in every interaction with every passenger every day. The sharp click of her watch against the table punctuated this final point. Gabrielle paused, letting the significance of these changes sink in. The persistent hum of the climate system filled the momentary silence. Then she addressed the unspoken question in the room. You may be wondering why I didn't identify myself immediately when the discrimination began. Why I allowed the situation to unfold rather than using my position to prevent it. Her right index finger tapped twice against her thumb, that subtle centering gesture now recognized by everyone present. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each executive. The collective rustle of clothing marked their attention, all eyes focused on their CEO. I conduct these incognito inspections precisely to see how our employees behave when they don't know who's watching, when they're making decisions based on their own values rather than external oversight. What I witnessed on Friday wasn't just one employee's bias. It was a reflection of gaps in our hiring, training, and accountability systems that allowed that bias to manifest unchecked. This perspective shifted the focus from individual blame to collective responsibility, not excusing Jessica Rivera's behavior, but recognizing that it had flourished within an organizational context that each person in the room had helped create. The thoughtful sighs punctuated this realization. As leaders, Gabrielle continued, we're responsible not just for stating values, but for building systems that ensure those values are lived in practice. Friday's flight showed us that we have significant work to do in that regard. The golden flecks in her eyes caught the light as she gazed around the table. The meeting continued for 3 hours with detailed discussion of implementation strategies for each aspect of the action plan. The persistent scratch of pens on paper, tap of fingers on tablets, and occasional clink of water glasses marked the productive exchange of ideas. By the time it concluded, Wright Aviation had charted a new course, not just responding to a single incident, but committing to fundamental changes in how the company operated. As the executives filed out, the brisk rustle of their clothing and click of their shoes marking their departure, Gabrielle asked Captain Isabella Ramirez to remain behind. The captain's uniform rustled crisply as she complied, standing at parade rest near the conference table. Once they were alone, Gabrielle's formal demeanor softened slightly. Isabella, she said, using the captain's first name for the first time that day. I wanted to thank you personally for your intervention on Friday's flight. You demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership I hope to foster throughout Wright Aviation. Ramirez nodded, accepting the acknowledgement with professional grace. Her uniform badge caught the light as she shifted her stance slightly. I should have acted sooner, she admitted. When I first noticed the tension during boarding, I prioritized flight preparations over investigating the situation fully. You made a judgment call based on the information you had, Gabrielle responded. When you returned to the cabin and observed directly, you took appropriate action. That's what matters. The purposeful tap of her finger against the conference table punctuated her assessment. What will happen to Wilson? Ramirez asked, referring to her co-pilot who had remained silent despite overhearing the discrimination during boarding. Her voice carried genuine concern for her colleague despite his failure. He'll be required to complete additional ethics training, Gabrielle replied. But more importantly, he'll participate in developing new guidelines for cockpit crew responsibility regarding passenger discrimination. His experience recognizing wrongdoing but feeling unable to address it is unfortunately common and needs to be part of our solution. The subtle rustle of papers as she gathered her notes marked the practical nature of this approach. Ramirez nodded, appreciating the balance of accountability and educational opportunity. The slight creak of her leather shoes marked her shift in posture. I'm promoting you to Director of Flight Operations, Gabrielle continued, moving to the next matter at hand. You've been on my radar for this position for some time, and Friday's events only confirmed what I already knew about your character and judgment. Ramirez's eyes widened slightly, the overhead light catching the surprise in her expression. The position represented a significant advancement in her career trajectory, with broader responsibility for flight standards across Wright Aviation's entire fleet. The sharp intake of her breath marked her momentary loss of professional composure. "Thank you, Ms. Wright. I'm honored by your confidence." The slight tremor in her voice betrayed her emotion despite her maintained poise. "It's well earned," Gabrielle assured her. "And in your new role, you'll have significant input on how we reshape our company culture to better reflect our values." As Ramirez departed to begin her new responsibilities, the crisp click of the door closing behind her marked the transition to Gabrielle's next priority. She turned her attention to Michael Thompson, the security officer who had hesitated initially but ultimately stood against the discrimination. He had been invited to a meeting regarding the security training restructuring she had mentioned during the flight. "Officer Thompson," Gabrielle greeted him. "Thank you for coming." The firm rustle of his uniform marked his slight bow of acknowledgement. "As I mentioned on Friday, we're overhauling our security training to address how protocols can be misused to justify biased treatment." Michael nodded, his expression serious. The scar above his eye caught the light as he shifted position. "It's an issue I've observed throughout my career. Security concerns are sometimes invoked selectively depending on who's involved." "Exactly," Gabrielle agreed. "And I'd like you to lead the team developing our new training approach. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable." The definitive tap of her finger against the tablet screen punctuated her offer. Like the offer to Ramirez, it represented both recognition of Thompson's integrity and an opportunity to create positive change within the organization. The heavy creak of his leather holster marked his straightening posture in response. "I appreciate the opportunity," Thompson said. "I've had ideas about this issue for years, but rarely had a platform to implement them." The subtle tapping of his fingers against his badge had stopped entirely, a physical sign of his newfound confidence. "Now you do," Gabrielle assured him. "And I expect you to be candid about what you've observed even when it's uncomfortable for us to hear." That afternoon, Gabrielle met with Maria Vasquez regarding the Frontline Advisory Committee. The brisk rustle of Maria's uniform announced her arrival as she entered Gabrielle's office. She had arrived nervous but determined, carrying a notebook filled with observations and suggestions based on her 3 years of flight experience. The rapid flutter of pages as she adjusted her grip betrayed her anxiety. "Ms. Wright," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding crew members who recognize wrongdoing but feel unable to address it. That describes so many of us." The quick tap of her fingers against her notebook punctuated her statement. Gabrielle nodded encouragingly. "Tell me more." The golden flecks in her eyes caught the light, revealing genuine interest. Maria's anxiety diminished as she shared her insights about the informal power dynamics among crew members, about the economic vulnerabilities that often silenced potential whistleblowers, about the subtle ways discrimination manifested in service delivery. The rhythmic rustle of pages being turned marked her progression through carefully prepared notes. "What would have made it easier for you to speak up on Friday's flight?" Gabrielle asked, genuinely interested in Maria's perspective. The deliberate tap of her finger against her desk marked the importance of this question. "A clear, safe reporting channel," Maria replied without hesitation, her previous nervousness replaced by passionate conviction. "If I'd had a way to alert someone about what was happening without confronting Jessica directly, someone with authority who could intervene without revealing who reported the issue, I would have used it immediately." The firm thump of her hand on the notebook emphasized her point. It was exactly the kind of practical insight Gabrielle had hoped for, something that couldn't be derived from executive-level discussions, but required the perspective of someone on the front lines. The appreciative nod of her head marked her recognition. "That's precisely why this committee is so important," Gabrielle affirmed. "You understand challenges that might not be visible from leadership positions." By the end of their meeting, Maria had been named co-chair of the Frontline Advisory Committee with responsibility for recruiting diverse representatives from throughout Wright Aviation's cabin crew ranks. The resolute click of Gabrielle's pen as she signed the official authorization marked this significant promotion. Later that week, Gabrielle fulfilled her promise to Angela Porter, the passenger who had documented the discrimination on Flight 247. Over lunch at Wright Aviation's headquarters, they discussed the marketing campaign focused on inclusive travel experiences. The rhythmic clink of silverware against fine china provided a backdrop to their conversation. The challenge, Angela explained, her silver hoop earrings catching the light as she gestured emphatically, is avoiding performative diversity that merely checks boxes while actually addressing the real pain points that marginalized travelers experience. Gabrielle nodded in agreement, the golden flecks in her eyes catching the light. Exactly. I don't want advertising that presents an idealized version of inclusive travel that doesn't match the actual passenger experience. What if the campaign was built around accountability? Angela suggested, the sharp tap of her finger against the table marking her excitement. Not promising perfection, but committing to addressing issues when they arise. That honesty would differentiate Wright Aviation from competitors who make vague promises about inclusion without specific commitments. The conversation continued, two Black women in business sharing insights drawn from personal experience as well as professional expertise. The melodic clink of coffee cups being refreshed punctuated their exchange of ideas. By the end of lunch, Angela had been offered a consulting contract to help shape Wright Aviation's marketing approach, not as a token diverse voice, but as a strategic partner with valuable perspective. Emma Rodriguez, the teenage passenger who had spoken up with such moral clarity, received a formal letter inviting her to apply for Wright Aviation's high school internship program. The letter, personally signed by Gabrielle, noted Emma's courage in standing against injustice and her expressed interest in building an ethical business career. The crisp rustle of premium stationery being removed from an envelope marked the beginning of Emma's professional journey. For Emma, the experience on Flight 247 had been transformative, providing a real-world example of how business leadership could be used to create positive change, rather than simply maximize profit. The internship opportunity represented a first step toward her own aspirations in that direction. Even the Morgans, the elderly couple who had eventually spoken up, received recognition for their intervention. A handwritten note from Gabrielle acknowledged their willingness to stand against injustice, noting that moral courage was not limited by age or circumstance. The deliberate scratch of Gabrielle's fountain pen across premium stationery had marked her appreciation. These individual acknowledgments were important, but they were only part of a broader transformation occurring throughout Wright Aviation. The incident on Flight 247 had catalyzed changes that might otherwise have taken years to implement, creating a company where stated values were increasingly matched by lived reality. In her private office, reviewing the progress of these initiatives, Gabrielle reflected on the paradox of her experience. The discrimination she had faced had been painful and humiliating, yet it had also revealed crucial information about her company's culture that might otherwise have remained hidden. That revelation, painful as it was, had created an opportunity for meaningful change, not just punishment for individual wrongdoing, but transformation of the systems that had allowed that wrongdoing to flourish. For Gabrielle Wright, that was the essence of effective leadership, using even negative experiences as catalysts for positive change, holding individuals accountable while also addressing the organizational contexts that shaped their behavior, and most importantly, ensuring that the company she had built truly reflected the values that had inspired its creation. The changes stemming from Flight 247 wouldn't be immediate or perfect. Cultural transformation was a journey rather than a destination, requiring consistent effort and vigilance. But the journey had begun with clear direction and genuine commitment, not just from Gabrielle, but from leaders and employees throughout Wright Aviation, who recognized both the moral and business imperatives of creating a truly inclusive company. That was the legacy that would ultimately emerge from the discrimination Gabrielle had experienced, not just consequences for those directly involved, but a fundamental reassessment of how Wright Aviation operated and the values it truly embodied in practice. 13. Immediate aftermath. 1. 1,000 words. The consequences for those directly involved in the discrimination unfolded swiftly. Jessica Rivera's termination was processed immediately upon landing her access to Wright Aviation systems revoked before she even left the airport. The electronic beep of her security credentials being deactivated marked the official end of her employment. Security escorted her to collect her belongings from the crew lounge, the measured click of their footsteps on the polished floor marking her final journey through the facility. The walk of shame was witnessed by colleagues who had long observed her discriminatory behavior, but never expected it would carry consequences. As Jessica cleared out her locker, the metallic clang of the door closing punctuating her final act as a Wright Aviation employee, the reality of her situation sank in with crushing weight. 12 years of employment gone. Her $86,000 annual salary and comprehensive benefits package terminated. The assisted living facility for her mother cost $5,700 per month. How would she cover that now? The hollow rustle of personal items being placed in a cardboard box marked the dismantling of her career. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured to a former colleague who stood awkwardly nearby, the quiet words barely audible in the tense silence. "One mistake and my entire career is over." "It wasn't one mistake, Jessica," the colleague replied quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "It was who you've been the entire time I've known you. We all saw it. We just never thought anyone with power would care enough to do anything about it." That simple statement crystallized the fundamental miscalculation Jessica had made throughout her career. She had believed that her prejudice was either invisible or acceptable to those with authority. The revelation that Gabrielle Wright cared deeply about how passengers were treated, regardless of their perceived status, had shattered that assumption irrevocably. The hollow click of her locker room access badge being surrendered marked the final severing of her connection to Wright Aviation. For Richard Donovan, the aftermath unfolded more gradually but no less devastatingly. Upon returning to Donovan Industries headquarters, he found his executive team assembled in the conference room, their expressions grim. The tense rustle of papers being nervously arranged betrayed their anxiety. The board chairman had called an emergency meeting for the following morning. Wright Aviation's contract cancellation represented 38% of annual revenue, a financial catastrophe that couldn't be hidden from shareholders. "How bad is it?" Donovan asked his CFO, already knowing the answer. His signet ring clicked rapidly against the polished conference table, betraying his agitation. "Terminal unless we find replacement contracts immediately," the financial officer replied bluntly, the harsh rustle of spreadsheets marking his grim assessment. "Our stock will drop at least 40% when this news breaks. We'll need to begin layoffs within 30 days. The banks will call our loans when they see the quarterly projections." Donovan sank into his chair, the heavy leather creaking under his weight. The full implications of his behavior on Flight 247 finally penetrated his consciousness. His entire business empire, inherited from his father and maintained through connections rather than innovation, was collapsing because he couldn't accept a black woman sitting in his seat on an airplane. The defeated tap of his signet ring against his watch band had slowed to a resigned rhythm. "Can we sue Wright Aviation for breach of contract?" he asked desperately, his voice lacking its usual confident edge. The general counsel shook his head, the brisk rustle of legal documents marking his negative assessment. "The contract includes a moral conduct clause that allows them to terminate if our leadership engages in behavior contrary to their corporate values. Discrimination is explicitly mentioned. They're on solid legal ground." "What about my personal reputation?" Donovan demanded, his cufflinks clicking rapidly as he gestured in agitation. "Can we prevent details of the incident from becoming public?" Multiple passengers were recording. The PR director explained the decisive tap of her stylus against a tablet punctuating her assessment. One video is already circulating on social media. We can try to control the narrative, but we can't suppress the information entirely. The reality was inescapable. Richard Donovan had destroyed his company and potentially his career through a single instance of discriminatory behavior, or rather through the revelation of biases he had harbored and expressed throughout his life, finally directed at someone with the power to impose consequences. The angry thump of his fist against the conference table marked his belated recognition of this fact. For Wright, aviation employees, the aftermath of Flight 247 brought a mixture of anxiety and hope. The intense hum of conversation throughout the headquarters carried both emotions simultaneously. The anxiety stemmed from uncertainty about how far the accountability measures would extend, who else might lose their position due to past behavior similar to Jessica's. The hope came from the recognition that the company's stated values were being meaningfully enforced rather than remaining mere words on a mission statement. This mixture was evident in the company-wide communication Gabrielle sent the Monday following the incident. The synchronized ping of thousands of email notifications across the company marked its arrival. The message was direct and unsparing in its assessment of what had occurred, but it also focused on structural changes rather than individual blame. What happened on Flight 247 wasn't just one employee's failure, but a reflection of gaps in our hiring, training, and accountability systems. Moving forward, Wright, aviation will implement comprehensive changes to ensure our actual passenger experience matches our stated commitment to treating everyone with equal dignity and respect. The message outlined the specific initiatives being launched, from revised hiring processes to the Frontline Advisory Committee, emphasizing that these changes weren't punitive but constructive, designed to build a stronger company that truly lived its values rather than merely claiming them. For most employees, this framing transformed anxiety into engagement. The energetic hum of conversation shifted from worried whispers to productive exchanges. Rather than fearing arbitrary punishment for past mistakes, they saw an opportunity to participate in meaningful improvement of the company culture. The Frontline Advisory Committee received over 200 applications within the first week, the steady electronic chime of submissions marking the enthusiastic response from crew members eager to contribute their perspectives to this transformation. For the passengers who had witnessed the discrimination on Flight 247, the aftermath brought a sense of resolution that discrimination victims rarely experienced. Angela Porter received regular updates on Wright Aviation's marketing transformation, along with a formal consulting contract to contribute her expertise to that process. The resolute rustle of the premium paper contract being signed marked the beginning of this professional partnership. Emma Rodriguez proudly shared her internship invitation with her social studies class, using it as the basis for a presentation on corporate social responsibility. The surprised gasps of her classmates punctuated her account of meeting a billionaire CEO and standing against injustice. Even the Morgans found meaning in the experience, sharing the story with friends in their retirement community and emphasizing the importance of speaking up against injustice regardless of age. "You're never too old to stand for what's right," Harold told a neighbor who asked about the incident. "And sometimes your voice makes more difference than you might expect." For Captain Isabella Ramirez, the aftermath brought new responsibilities as Director of Flight Operations, with authority to reshape training and accountability systems for all Wright Aviation pilots. The authoritative click of her new office door closing marked her entrance into senior leadership. Her first initiative was a mandatory session on crew responsibility during incidents of passenger discrimination, using Flight 247 as a case study while protecting the identities of those involved. Michael Thompson began developing the revised security training program, drawing on his 15 years of experience to address how bias could influence the application of safety protocols. The deliberate scratch of his pen across a whiteboard marked the development of new training scenarios. His first presentation to Wright Aviation's security team was titled "Safety Without Prejudice, Maintaining Security While Ensuring Dignity for All Passengers." Maria Vasquez embraced her co-chair role on the Frontline Advisory Committee, collecting perspectives from crew members throughout the Wright Aviation network and synthesizing them into actionable recommendations. The purposeful tap of her fingers on her tablet marked her documentation of these diverse voices. Her experience on Flight 247, recognizing wrongdoing but feeling unable to address it, informed the committee's first major initiative, an anonymous reporting system for crew members to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. These immediate aftermath activities represented just the beginning of Wright Aviation's transformation, the first steps in a journey toward becoming a company where stated values were consistently matched by lived reality, where every passenger truly received equal respect regardless of appearance or perceived status, and where employees at all levels felt empowered to uphold those values even when no executives were watching. 14. Epilogue. 1,000 words. 6 months after the events of Flight 247, the ripple effects continued to spread through lives and organizations forever changed by that single journey. Jessica Rivera sat in the break room of a regional charter service staring at her phone where a news alert announced Wright Aviation's latest achievement: the company had been named Most Inclusive Airline by a leading industry publication with specific praise for its comprehensive approach to ensuring equal treatment for all passengers. The persistent ping of new message notifications provided a counterpoint to her thoughts. The article mentioned the watershed moment 6 months earlier that had catalyzed the company's transformation, a discriminatory incident that had revealed gaps between stated values and actual passenger experience. While Jessica wasn't mentioned by name, she recognized herself in the carefully anonymized description of a senior flight attendant whose treatment of passengers revealed unconscious bias that had gone unchecked for years. The bitter sigh that escaped her lips was barely audible in the quiet break room. Her new position paid less than half what she'd earned at Wright Aviation. The benefits were minimal, covering only basic health care with no vision or dental. Her mother had been moved to a state-subsidized facility that provided adequate but far less comfortable care than her previous arrangement. The stiff rustle of her uniform polyester, now not the premium wool blend of Wright Aviation, marked her diminished professional status. More painfully, Jessica's professional standing had collapsed completely. Once respected as a senior flight attendant with valuable experience, she was now relegated to the industry's margins, working routes no one else wanted for a company that represented a significant step backward in her career. The harsh creak of the plastic break room chair beneath her weight seemed to mock her former first-class status. "You should be thankful you found any aviation position," her new supervisor had told her bluntly during hiring the harsh fluorescent break room lights, emphasizing his unsympathetic expression. "Most airlines won't touch you after what happened at Wright." The most difficult aspect wasn't the financial consequences, but the way the incident had forced Jessica to confront truths about herself she had long avoided. In quiet moments of painful honesty, she had to acknowledge that her behavior on Flight 247 hadn't been an aberration, but a revelation of attitudes she had harbored throughout her career, attitudes that had harmed countless passengers who lacked Gabrielle Wright's power to impose consequences. The irritated tap of her fingernail against her phone screen marked her discomfort with this realization. That recognition brought no redemption or growth, just the bitter understanding that she had sabotaged her own career through biases she still struggled to acknowledge fully, even to herself. The mechanical hum of the break room refrigerator provided a backdrop to her regrets. For Richard Donovan, the aftermath had been equally devastating, but with an unexpected turn. Donovan Industries had indeed lost 42% of its stock value when Wright Aviation's contract cancellation became public. The formal rustle of resignation papers marked his forced departure from the company his father had built. The board had demanded his resignation, installing a new CEO focused on rebuilding the company's reputation and client relationships. The story of how Donovan had lost a multi-million-dollar contract through discriminatory behavior spread throughout the industry, making him a case study in how personal prejudice could translate into business catastrophe. The abrupt click of connections being severed marked his social isolation, as former associates distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by association with such a public failure. Yet from this professional collapse came something unexpected, a genuine personal reckoning. Forced for the first time to examine the attitudes and assumptions that had shaped his behavior, Donovan began the painful process of confronting his own biases, not from virtue, but necessity, as he realized how thoroughly those biases had destroyed everything he valued. 6 months later, he was working with a diversity consultant, not for public rehabilitation, but for private understanding. The deliberate scratch of his pen on a journal marked his ongoing self-examination. "I lost my company because I couldn't see past my own prejudices," he admitted, during one session, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "I need to understand why not to save my career, but to avoid being that person anymore." It was a small step on a long journey, but it represented something few would have predicted: the possibility that consequences properly applied could catalyze genuine change, even in those who had seemed most resistant to it. The thoughtful rustle of pages turning in his personal journal marked this unexpected transformation. For Wright Aviation, the transformation had been comprehensive and ongoing. The energetic hum of activity throughout headquarters carried a renewed sense of purpose. The initiatives launched immediately after Flight 247 had expanded into a fundamental reassessment of how the company operated at every level. Hiring processes now included scenario-based evaluations of how candidates responded to diverse passengers. Training focused on practical application, rather than theoretical compliance. The Frontline Advisory Committee had direct input into service policies and practices. Most significantly, the company culture had shifted from passive non-discrimination to active inclusion, not just avoiding negative behaviors, but proactively ensuring that every passenger received equally excellent service, regardless of appearance or background. The purposeful click of keyboards throughout the company marked the ongoing documentation of this cultural transformation. The business results had been remarkable. Customer satisfaction scores increased by 24% in 6 months. Employee retention improved, particularly among diverse staff members who reported feeling more valued and respected. New clients were attracted by Wright Aviation's reputation for ethical leadership and consistent service quality. The constant ping of positive online reviews created a steady rhythm of validation. As part of its new commitment to creating pathways into aviation for underrepresented groups, Wright Aviation had also launched a scholarship program for young people from disadvantaged communities interested in aviation careers. The program was specifically designed to address the very barrier Gabrielle herself had encountered years ago, when her high school guidance counselor had told her the industry wasn't designed for people like you. The enthusiastic chatter of the first cohort of scholarship recipients touring the company headquarters marked the beginning of this initiative. At the center of this transformation, Gabrielle Wright continued to lead with the same quiet strength she had demonstrated on Flight 247. The confident rustle of her suit as she moved through the headquarters carried the same unassuming authority. The discrimination she had experienced hadn't diminished her. If anything, it had reinforced her commitment to building a company that truly reflected her founding vision. Once each quarter, she still traveled incognito on Wright Aviation flights, observing how service was delivered when employees didn't know the CEO was watching. The subtle tap of her fingernail against her watch face marked these ongoing inspections. The difference now was dramatic, not perfect, but significantly improved, with crew members demonstrating the inclusive approach that had become integral to the company culture rather than merely stated in its policies. For the others whose paths had crossed on Flight 247, life continued with the quiet influence of that shared experience. Captain Isabella Ramirez excelled in her role as Director of Flight Operations, implementing training reforms that became models for the industry. The authoritative rustle of her uniform, now adorned with the additional stripes of her new position, marked her elevated status within the company. Michael Thompson's security training program was adopted by 3 other airlines, recognizing its effectiveness in maintaining safety while ensuring dignity for all passengers. The enthusiastic applause during industry presentations marked the recognition of his innovative approach. Maria Vasquez was promoted to senior cabin crew trainer, bringing her frontline perspective to new employee orientation. The confident click of her heels on training room floors marked her new authority. The anonymous reporting system she helped develop had already addressed 17 potential incidents before they escalated to the level experienced on Flight 247. Angela Porter's consulting work with Wright Aviation expanded into a specialized practice focusing on authentic inclusion in corporate marketing, with clients seeking her expertise in avoiding performative diversity while creating genuinely inclusive customer experiences. The characteristic jingle of her silver hoop earrings remained her trademark as she presented to corporate clients. Emma Rodriguez began her internship with Wright Aviation's corporate social responsibility team, gaining practical experience to support her dream of building an ethical business career. The enthusiastic tap-tap-tap of her fingers on her first professional laptop marked her entrance into the business world she had always dreamed of joining. The Morgans continued sharing their experience with friends and family, emphasizing that moral responsibility didn't diminish with age, and that speaking up against injustice remained important throughout life. The rhythmic click of Eleanor's pearl necklace punctuated their retelling of the story that had become a personal touchstone. 6 months after Flight 247, these individual stories had combined to create something larger than any single narrative, a demonstration of how accountability properly applied could transform not just one company, but potentially an entire industry. Wright Aviation had become a case study in how to address discrimination effectively, not through performative gestures or empty policies, but through substantive changes in hiring, training, accountability, and corporate culture. Industry publications began featuring Wright Aviation's transformation as a model for other companies seeking to address similar challenges. The intent rustle of magazine pages being turned in boardrooms across the country marked the spread of these practices. What made the approach particularly compelling was its holistic nature, recognizing that discrimination wasn't solved through one-off training sessions or public statements, but through comprehensive restructuring of how a company operated at every level. Most powerfully, the story of Flight 247 had begun circulating widely through business schools and corporate training programs, anonymized to protect those involved, but with the essential lessons intact. It served as a vivid illustration of how prejudice could manifest even in companies with official anti-discrimination policies, and how meaningful accountability could create positive change, not just for direct victims, but for entire organizational cultures. The story resonated because it contained universal truths that character was revealed through behavior when people thought no one important was watching. That economic vulnerability often silenced those who recognized injustice but feared the personal cost of intervention. That true leadership involved holding firm to principles even when compromise might be more profitable in the short term. For Gabrielle Wright, watching her company's transformation unfold, the personal humiliation she had experienced on that flight had been transformed into something unexpectedly valuable, an opportunity to see her organization with clear eyes and address issues that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath polished corporate statements and official policies. The discrimination hadn't diminished her. It had ultimately strengthened both her resolve and her company. By responding not with vindictiveness but with principled accountability and structural reform, she had created something more powerful than punishment alone could achieve, a demonstration that organizations could evolve toward greater justice when their leaders truly committed to that journey. In her private moments, Gabrielle sometimes reflected on the painful paradox at the heart of her experience that she had needed to be the target of discrimination to fully understand how it operated within the company she had built. That personal cost had been real, but so was the transformation it had catalyzed, not just within Wright Aviation, but potentially throughout an industry long challenged by issues of inclusion and equal treatment. Success, she often reminded her leadership team, isn't defined by never facing challenges, but by how we respond to them when they arise. Wright Aviation had responded to the challenge of Flight 247 by becoming more fully the company it had always claimed to be, one where every passenger truly received equal dignity and respect regardless of appearance, background, or perceived status. One where employees at all levels felt empowered to uphold those values even when no executives were watching. That was the lasting legacy of Flight 247, not just consequences for those directly involved, but transformation for an entire organization and potentially an industry. From discrimination had come accountability, and from accountability had come genuine substantive change. And that might be the most important lesson of all. If you've found value in this story about standing up against discrimination, hit subscribe and comment justice below. Together, we can create a world where people are judged by their character, not by assumptions about who they are or where they belong.